On today's episode, we're sitting down with Oren Cass. Oren Cass is the founder of American Compass. It's a conservative Republican think tank that is focused on the American worker and the value it brings to today's society. Let's get into it.
I'm Sean O'Brien, General President of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters.
Put your helmets on, buckle your chin straps. It's a full contact sport.
We're going to find out who has a better bad idea. Oren Cass today, who are you and what do you do?
Who am I and what I do? I am a policy wonk, I guess is the polite term. Most people just call me a nerd. I read and write about economic policy all day and try to get the Republican Party and the conservative movement to focus first and foremost on workers as the core of a strong economy and a strong nation.
And I know what you're thinking. You're looking at me saying, I'm having a nerd-to-nerd conversation, right?
So I was just thinking, I'm rarely out-nerded on a podcast, but this looks like the time.
I appreciate that. So tell us about yourself. Where'd you grow up, your education, and what influenced you into being who you are today, which I'm a big fan and admirer.
Oh, I appreciate the feeling is certainly mutual. I really appreciate the chance to be here. I grew up in central Massachusetts, went to funky charter school back in the days when they were less focused on inner city reform and more on just—
What was that funky charter school?
It was called the Francis W. Parker Charter Essential School. And the essential school movement was it was very experimental. We didn't have grades A, B, C. We didn't have grades 7th, 8th, 9th. So very alternative.
What were those classes like? I mean, what grade would you say you started there, and what was that like?
Yeah, so I started with middle school, so 7th grade all the way through high school graduation. And the idea was basically that we really only had 2 big classes every day. We had one for all the humanities and English stuff and one for all the math and science stuff. And we had phenomenal teachers. I always think back to those teachers as the ones that really made the difference in my life and set me on my course. And they sort of challenged you at your level. And when you were done with that class, you got to move on to the next one. And so real emphasis on sort of critical thinking and research and debate. And I got hooked on policy debate. I was one of those high school policy debate nerds. And ever since knew I was going to be arguing with people about public policy as long as I could make a living doing it.
So it's great. You can argue with people and get paid for it.
That's right. I was going to be arguing with people anyway. I may as well get paid for it.
Yeah, I know. I'm like of the same makeup. I get up in the morning and I start my day with an argument in the mirror. And that's how we prep for the day. But all seriousness, no, after you graduate high school, you go to Williams College. What attracted you to Williams? I'm sure you got into a lot of other colleges, but was that your first choice, or what was the reasoning behind going there?
It was. It's funny. I've since learned how people are supposed to do their college search, which is apparently quite intensive. I received a lot of brochures, looked at them, didn't want to go to a big Ivy League university, wanted to go to a smaller place, didn't want to be in a city. And Williams had a big purple cow on the cover, and its slogan, at least my year, was obsessively unpretentious. And I'd driven through the town once and remembered it being very pretty, and that was good enough for me. So I think I only applied to Williams at Amherst and headed out to Williams and was loved it. It was a great place to grow up in a sense, I guess.
So what influence did your parents have on your education? What are they academic as well?
They are not. They're my can I say my parents are fascinating people. They're American, but they both, their families independently moved to Israel in the late 1960s. After the Six-Day War, there were a lot of Jewish families that were very Zionist who they'd say made Aliyah to Israel. And so they met at the American school in Jerusalem. But in a sense, therefore, they're not immigrants to America. They're American, but they grew up in a sense in a foreign country. And, my dad served in the army there. They got married on a kibbutz. They came back to the U.S. so my dad could go to college in his mid-20s. And that's when I was born. And my name is Oren because they always figured they were going back to Israel. It would be, they spell Oren correctly on the coffee cups in Israel. It's a very
Yeah, but you couldn't get a ruler in school with your name on it. That wasn't a common name.
Here, not at all, certainly. Anyway, they ended up staying here. And so, kind of grew up in a fairly traditional suburban existence. My dad ran a small business from home. My mom was I'm the oldest of four. And so I think they, certainly they took a quite alternative approach to education. The American school in Jerusalem in the late 1960s was not an especially conventional place, to say the least. And I think they just always, brought a point of view and instilled in me a perspective of sort of valuing the education for the sake of the education, valuing the independent thinking, and really sort of focusing your life first and foremost on, building a family, being situated in a community, and doing something productive. And so I think even I describe my sort of lack of a college search, like the idea of like, well, you go to the best college you can get into, and then the best investment banking job you can get from there was never even on my radar. And I think, certainly not anything they expected or were pushing for in any way.
So you were influenced more or less by the education you got in high school, junior high or in high school, and you knew that you wanted to debate, right? And so you go to Williams College. What did you major in?
I majored in political economy, which is perfect. What I'm
now,
still
right?
doing. One of the very few places where you could even do that. It would sort of closest parallel is kind of a government major. But what it meant, I always say half joking, but actually quite serious. It's kind of like political science without all the reading, and economics without all the math.
Right.
It's sort of the very practical applied side.
I wish I knew that back then. I might have taken that curriculum. Think about it. History without the reading and math without doing the problems.
Judging from what you do now, you would have excelled in political economy, because it is a lot like economics, but it recognizes that the sort of formal whiteboard economics doesn't really get you that far in the real world. And you have to understand analysis of economics and markets through the lens of real life and the political world, and both the wonderful things and limitations of all of us as people.
The political world's a little different, obviously, these days. But before you identified as a policy researcher, and also, I would say you're an influencer as well these days. Did you always identify with the Republican Party when you were in high school and when you were in, because it's no secret you are a Republican, did you always identify with the Republican Party at a young age?
Not especially. I would say, I grew up and in the kind of school I was going to, there were no Republicans. I remember in the mid 90s, there was the one kid who was a Bob Dole supporter, and that was like a funny curiosity.
You guys shunned him, right?
No, it was just kind of cute, right?
Yeah.
Like, oh, okay, that's
who's
like,
Bob Dole?
Some people have mohawks, some people say they're Bob Dole supporters. It wasn't really kind of a thing. But I realized in hindsight, I was extremely what I call small c conservative. I had no connection to the political conservative movement, but for whatever reason, my instincts and intuitions were, it turns out, very conservative. I remember, making a huge mess in the student government, doing things like saying, well, we should have a rule that like all homework is optional because it should be a matter of personal responsibility. And if you don't do it, then like
you don't get
either
credit for it.
It was important homework and you suffer, or it was useless homework and then good for you for not doing it. So, a more kind of typical libertarian.
Free thinking.
Yeah, sort of thing. I remember I did a project sort of, which this one I'm more embarrassed by in hindsight, sort of, lambasting the idea that people would give money to an addiction treatment program, because why should people give their own money to some organization to help other people who have other problems? That's certainly not my view now, but that's sort of the kind of starting point I was coming from in a lot of ways. And it wasn't until I got to college and discovered, there actually is an intellectual architecture out there. Like, I was not the only person reading the New York Times editorial page and getting very frustrated.
Right.
And so that was where I sort of started to find more of a home and understand that there's a whole tradition here. There are many great thinkers here. There are important ideas here. But still never, I would say, identified strongly with the Republican Party necessarily, or that kind of what we typically call the conservative establishment.
Right.
And so I never did the summer fellowships reading all the Milton Friedman and Friedrich Hayek. And so I think as a result, I've ended up kind of moving up in this world, but never really got all of the training or brainwashing, depending on how you want to
brainwashing can work
it.
on both parties, I guess.
Absolutely.
Right? Mom and dad, what were their political affiliations?
I guess they're probably nominally Democrats, but certainly not passionate about it. I remember one of my favorite memories is my father always proudly quoting his father, you can't engineer social change, or you can't legislate social change. And he would say that and pound his hand on the table. And so I think, they were probably culturally and politically more inclined to the left of center, but not at all on, not dyed in the wool progressive activists to say the least.
The far left, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's crazy. So you graduate Williams College and you go work for Bane Capital.
No, Bane and Company.
Bane Company.
The good Bane.
The good Bane, but there's two Banes, right?
Yes.
Same owner at the time, or same founder?
So that's right. It's interesting, actually. And I distinguished them because, Bane and Company is a consulting firm.
Right.
And so decades ago, they basically said, well, what if we took all of our ideas about how to give advice on businesses and actually used it to buy businesses and run them ourselves? Mm-hmm. And so they took a bunch of investment
Which is like private equity, right?
Yes, exactly. And so they took a bunch of investment from people at Bane and Company and used it to found Bane Capital.
So I want to hear a funny story. Bane Capital in the 90s and 2000, they were private equity, and private equity was a devil back then, right? Because in our world, they would buy distressed companies, profit them up, leverage them up, workers suffer, company gets sold, private equity gets paid big bucks. So Bane Capital was, a very, very popular and very formidable opponent to a lot of companies that we represented nationwide and locally. But ironically, our pension fund, New England Teamsters Pension Fund, owned 175 Dartmouth Street, which was Bane's headquarters. And I remember when I became a trustee on the board, I'm like, let's kick them out. Let's kick them out. And like, why? I'm like, we fight these people all the time. We fight corporate America. Why are we having them as tenants? And that's when you learned about fiduciary responsibility, and you can't basically they've got to run parallel even though you got personal failings. So it's just a funny story. It's like, all right, so we invest our pension money into all these real estate transactions and other investments, and yet we're leasing to, so to speak, our enemy. So we eventually sold the building with a lot of pressure from me on that. But it was just ironic how those two worlds run parallel. Did you work in the Boston office?
Yes, yeah. So I was probably in that Dartmouth Street office, and so I thought you were going to say that the pension was literally invested with Bane Capital.
No.
Which there are plenty of unions that do that.
That's another debate that we have every day, because as trustees, and we sit on a lot of multi-employer pension funds. You've got a diverse asset allocation where X amount of percent goes into real estate investment, private equity, bonds, whatever the case may be. And a lot of times private equity spins off 10 to 18% of earnings. So it's a good investment. Problem is that we don't look at sometimes who we're investing in. And the one thing I've paid attention to over the last 10 or 12 years is when these private equity managers are coming in to pitch to a pension fund, you look at their portfolio, and I'm looking at our one of the pitches that came to us probably about 10 or 12 years ago, and I identified Uber, I identified, a lot of non-union companies that we're taking our members' pension fund money, investing in basically our demise. So we've put a stop to a lot of that stuff. But you're right, a lot of times you're investing in the enemy, so to speak. But getting back to your rise at Bane Companies, how did you end up at Bane?
Yeah, well, basically it's because that's where you go after Williams. I mean, I remember, this was the mid 2000s, and basically the companies in particular that would come and recruit on campus, particularly for folks with economics, including policy interest, were for the most part consulting firms and investment banks. And so I kind of signed up for a bunch of interviews with both. Investment banks, I simply could not understand what they were doing. This was right at the peak of the mortgage bubble, and let's buy up these and chop them up and repackage them and sell them that way. And I go to the cocktail hours and the info sessions, and you literally try to ask these people I don't understand. What are you doing? What is this job?
You get stonewalled, right?
And there was no answer. And I distinctly remember I was a fairly good little interviewer, and ended up heading down to New York for some final round interviews.
Well, we could look at it as interviewer or interrogator.
Well, yeah, I mean, right. I mean, I was as the interviewee was,
right.
And I was in my final round Goldman Sachs interview, and they asked me well, why do you want to work at Goldman Sachs? And I said I don't know if I want to work at Goldman Sachs. That's why I'm interested in the internship. I would really like to understand better what it is. That was not, let me tell you, that was not a correct answer.
That must have been offensive to those.
That was extreme.
Those mucky mucks.
Yes, that was, and you know what? Everybody here is here because this is what they want to be doing.
And how dare you question our integrity?
And so I discovered this was not what I was meant to be doing. Consulting, we could talk some more there. I have positive and negative things to say about consulting, but I understood what they were doing. There were a lot of people I really respected who had gone that route and had positive things to say about it. And I think most importantly, and I still tell anyone in college, I say it is an incredible place to go spend a few years. The amount, the quality of the training, the chance to work in so many different businesses, the chance to work in so many different aspects and on so many different issues is incredible.
So it's a diverse assignment, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so you're basically working on a bunch of different projects, bunch of different demographics, and that's helping you shape and mold your personal views on a lot of the business aspects, economics, policy in this country. So you go there as an intern. Does Williams have a big alumni that went to Bane? Or because a lot of times, a lot of these colleges, you'll see a lot of these private equity companies that are managed by a Harvard grad who worked at Goldman Sachs. Everybody on that team is from, Harvard or was at Goldman Sachs. Is that the same with Williams?
Yeah, Williams is a lot smaller. I mean, just overall, it's a smaller school. And I would say the majority, at least when I was there, of the recruiting at a place like Bane was from the big Ivy League universities. But there was the sort of little Williams contingent. And we always thought of the Dartmouth folks as our, co-conspirators in the woodsy demographic. And so, in each cohort each year, there would be another 3 or 4 Williams kids, and you then you could see those all the way up to, and there's the couple of senior partners who were Williams folks. And so it certainly wasn't a Williams-oriented place, but it was nice to have that certainly as a network to draw on.
So you interned there. Tell us about that journey and your path to where you are now.
Yeah, so I found it just incredibly engaging and challenging work. In that breadth of different things that you do. So my intern summer, we were literally working on the manufacturing footprint for a big, U.S. industrial company. Then I get back there to start full time and was working on a software sales project for the first 3 months, and then a financial services company for 3 months, and then a little sensor maker. And so, and on so many different issues. One was pricing. One was where should we have our manufacturing facilities? One was sales strategy. And so really enjoyed that. The flip side, though, was that I could see that I loved what I was doing as a new analyst. You collect all the data, you play with it, you understand it. Looking ahead, I could also see that, as a partner, let's say, obviously, you don't actually get to do that. You are in client services. And as someone who likes to argue for a living, client services is not, turns out, the ideal fit.
No, client services, I would assume, and you can explain it to us, especially in your role, is to give options. not opinions, right?
Well, and even more so, it is to build relationships. And, I have a lot of respect for what those folks do. And as I have matured myself, I've come to understand the importance of that. But building and maintaining relationships and being an advisor and somebody who provides options, what just wasn't how I had any interest in spending my time. And so, I knew even going in, public policy was always what I eventually wanted to do. And so it was quite open with everyone from the beginning that, as long as I'm doing a great job and you like having me here and I like being here, that's great. But I can see down the road, this is not a long-term career for me. And so I think actually during my second year, I took a 6-month leave to intern on Mitt Romney's 2008 presidential campaign, what we call the more failed Romney campaign.
Yeah.
When everyone else was going off to business school, that's when I went off to law school. And to, again, no intention of being a lawyer, but to study the policy side.
I read a quote saying law school is really fun when you don't want to be a lawyer.
That is, that was always a throw-off line for me. That is now by an order of magnitude, apparently my greatest insight and piece of wisdom. It's true. Law school is amazing, just doing and that's when I took labor law, for instance, and realized, again, there are people who are there because they want to practice labor law. For me, it was understanding how the system works.
Did you tell your parents when you enrolled in Harvard Law School, which is a dream for most people, right, that you really didn't want to be a lawyer? You're just going for the hell of it, for the fun of it?
Yes. And so first of all, I think that was probably a relief to them that I wasn't planning to then, go work on secure corporate transactions or whatever. But no, I mean, look, and again, credit to Bane. Bane provides support to people who go to business school. They said they'll provide support to me to go to law school. And so I knew I would then owe them a couple more years afterward. But it was a phenomenal arrangement for me. They covered a lot of the cost of my being in law school. I was able to then go back to Bane and exactly finish up how long I knew I wanted to be there, which was move into the manager role, get the experience actually managing a team, because that is I think it's just incredibly important. That's probably
that's one of the toughest jobs, is managing people.
Yes, absolutely. And it would not have been my strength it is still not by any means.
And there's no exact science to it at all.
That's right. You have to do it.
There's so many different personalities, so many different situations, especially nowadays. So you're a fairly young man managing people probably 10, 12 years older than you. How did that go?
Well, so this is interesting, is that at a place like Bane, as a manager, you are managing those even younger whippersnappers, but you're expected to then work with a client team where the folks are not just a lot older than you, but also have been in an industry, they've been doing this job for 20 years. And this is exactly what people hate about consultants, right? When this group of kids shows up and they don't know what they're talking about. And I think that's where it can go either way, because I certainly saw situations where, you show up, you think you know better than they do. First of all, you don't. And second of all, even if you do, that's no way to actually.
Conversely, they may not have the ideas you have either, because you're seeing it from a different perspective, a different age group, different experiences. Yeah,
that's right. And there's a sort of specific set of skills. And I appreciate now that I am running an organization of my own, I even imagine where would it be valuable to have a consultant come in? Because if you're I spent about a year actually for a women's clothing retailer, which was, I became a great expert.
Right up her alley.
I became a great expert in the
We were talking about this last night. We actually ran into a bunch of girls that are students at Brandeis University, and my son plays hockey, my youngest, at Suffolk University, and they all know each other. So I love talking to young people, especially now with politics and everything else. And, we were asking each one of them, what do they do? And one girl says, one young lady says, well, I'm in finance. I said, okay. The other one says, well, I'm going to be a consultant. And I'm like, consult on what? And again, we walk away, we're walking down the street last night. Cause when you're old like us, at 10 o'clock at night when we used to be going out, we're walking home from having a decaf coffee so that we can sleep. So we're walking back and we're talking about consultants. And I'm like, what? First off, what does a 20-year-old know about anything? And I don't mean that disrespectfully, because when I was 20 years old, I thought I knew everything, right? I think we all did, and my kids as well. But we're talking about consulting. And I'm like, what is she going to consult in? She doesn't have any experience. Like, what do they teach in consulting? And of course, we get into this conversation about, well, I could maybe be a consultant someday at 52 years old because I've had some good life experiences, good and bad. I've made some good moves. I've made some bad moves. So I think you could add some value. And my partner, Christine's like, well, I could be a fashion consultant. Right? Which, probably the truth. But, getting back to the consulting, like how coming out of college does a 22, 23-year-old become a consultant to something he or she may have never experienced?
Yeah. Well, so this is a perfect example with women's fashion, which I was not and am still not admittedly an expert in. But let's say you have a huge chain of stores where you're selling all sorts of stuff, and you just know you're losing a lot of money on shoes. I, as a 23-year-old who's been trained to do what a consultant does, can actually do a really good job figuring out which sets of data you have in your various systems that you need to send me. I can actually organize that all into one database that's going to say by type of shoe, by year, by store, what was the price you were supposed to sell, how much did you have to discount it, what was the actual underlying cost of that shoe. Then I can go and say, okay, in which kinds of stores were the most expensive shoes actually successful versus in which did you have to discount them so much that you lost money on them. And then I can make a couple of slides for you that say, if you separate your stores this way, the high-end ones on Newbury Street in Boston versus the ones at the outlet mall, and separate your kinds of shoes this way, you could actually make a lot more money selling this kind of shoe here and this kind of shoe there. I don't know anything about shoes.
So it's all about data. It's all about analytics.
All about data.
All about habit.
That's right. And what you notice when I just described that, you could switch shoes to some kind of industrial widget. Mm-hmm. And it's actually the same steps of the process. Collect the data, analyze the data, make the recommendations. Now, where it can go wrong is if I think, in fact, that's all you need to do. There you go. I've solved it. I'm telling you what to do without realizing, for instance, that somebody who knows something about fashion will tell you, well, actually, if we don't have that more expensive shoe on the shelf, the person's not going to come in and buy the more expensive dress, or right? Like, and so that's where you have to combine the power of the analysis that can add a lot of value for somebody who is a shoe expert, but either doesn't know how or just doesn't have time to spend their day with a spreadsheet.
Or doesn't break it down enough to what's going to actually sell.
But recognize that has to be one input into a bigger set of decisions.
So being a fashion consultant at one point in time, like, do you know what the term drip means? Drip?
No. Maybe I did. Is this an acronym or a?
It could be an adjective, right? Because someone said to me one day, "Hey, I like your drip."
Oh, I have not heard that.
I go, "What the hell is drip?" It's like, it's your outfit. I'm like, all right, cool. So see, you learn something new every day.
That could be a newer trendy term.
It is. It's a new bougie trendy term.
Well, I'm proud then to say that I'm not familiar with.
So if you go home and listen, I'm honored to be spending Valentine's Day with you, right? You're married, obviously, right?
And I remembered before my wife did this morning.
Really?
That today was
so
Valentine's
when you go home
Day.
today, regardless of what she looks like, just say, "Hey, I love your drip." Well, see where that gets you.
So I have a daughter in middle school, and the middle school terminology is
it's awful.
So I've just been trying to sell her on how, like, let's make up a new term. Like, let's just make jump a term to mean surprised. Just start saying to your friends, "That's so jump," and I promise you it'll catch on.
So has it caught on?
Well, I sold it to one of her friends at dinner, and the friend was trying to be like, "Oh yeah, I've heard that before." And I was like,
"No kidding."
See,
you're an influencer.
So now I will bring drip back to Western Massachusetts at least.
Make drip sexy. So you go to work on Mitt Romney's first presidential campaign. Now you're working for Bane. How does he discover you, or you discover him, or how did you? Because I mean, a lot of times you don't get to meet the boss, right?
Yeah, it was, in this case, he had just finished his term as governor. And so a bunch of folks who had been at Bane and worked for him as governor were coming back to Bane. And so asking them sort of, hey, who do I talk to if I want to, try to be an intern was easy enough. And it was at a stage, they were just staffing up the presidential campaign where if you were kind of willing to show up and say, I don't cost anything. I'm really passionate about this. It's for a set of political folks who wanted to work with Romney, who himself had this kind of data consulting business background, saying like, I can like make the kinds of slides he wants was really valuable. And so they were like, sure, come, I
So
I
you
could do it for
weren't
6 months.
necessarily bought into the Republican presidential campaign. You were bought into Mitt Romney and the data and the services you could provide to him.
Yeah, so I was and still am a huge admirer of him personally. I thought and still think he would have been a great president. But from my perspective at that point, it was, it all comes together very well that he is in the same city I'm in. This is a time when I can do this. And half I just want to learn. I also know what I don't know and would simply like to experience what it means to do policy on a presidential campaign. And half this turned out to be very true. That kind of very generic set of consulting skills I was describing is also very useful in the policy world, where, especially on a presidential campaign, there are so many issues. No one can really be an expert on all of them.
And you're not influenced by one topic either, because you're pretty diverse in what you've done as a consultant. You're not married to one certain policy. And so, I mean, that brings tremendous value. And I think people sometimes lose sight of the fact that, if you're focusing on one issue and that's what your expertise is, you kind of lose perspective because you're not looking at something you normally would embrace, which may help you influence a change in your thought process and the policy.
Yeah, I think that's definitely right. And you also find, and especially on something like a campaign, which is just a crazy whirlwind, you need the specialists and you also need the utility players. And so being someone who could just be thrown at anything, in a sense, was valuable. And so I had a great time, learned an enormous amount. And then I think it was, literally the day I got back after my 6 months there, sent in all my law school applications.
That's great. So you worked on his campaign in 2008 and then 2012.
Yeah.
What were the difference between 8 and 12 from your viewpoint? What worked, what didn't work?
Well, we got farther.
Right.
I had a very different experience in 2012. I was actually in law school at the time and showed up basically as a summer intern between my second and third year of law school. This is typically when you go do your corporate law internship to become a corporate lawyer. And I wasn't doing that.
We call those white-collar crime syndicates.
White-collar crime syndicates. I believe they call them white shoe law firms is the other.
And I can't even imagine what they call me.
Well, there you go. I'm sure they would be happy to have you as a client at whatever the hourly rate.
Yeah, $1,200 an hour.
Yeah. So I showed up for the summer, and again, just because of the kind of stuff I was good at, basically ended up being the domestic policy director at the end of the summer. And they said, well, you have to stay. We were the front runner in the primary at that point. And I said, well, I have to finish law school. And we said, well, I guess we'll just do both. And so I took early morning and late afternoon classes at law school and showed up for half of them to be polite.
Now, did the law school know where you were working?
They did, and
so that might have helped a little bit, right? A little flexibility.
And to their credit, they were entirely supportive. The dean at the time, Martha Minow, was very far to the left, but this is what law school is for. What I was doing, she thought was important, and she allowed me to do an independent study and get some credit for it.
Yeah, I mean, Romney wasn't far to the right by any means. I mean, we worked. Obviously, he was the governor of Massachusetts. I think he pretty much they authored Obamacare after what he did in Massachusetts with the healthcare reform.
Yeah, there were a lot of similarities. I mean, it's funny to look back now and think of Joe Biden saying, Mitt Romney's going to put you back in chains or whatever else, that if you are the Republican nominee, you are immediately the bad guy in a lot of ways. But the school was very supportive of it. I even had a professor whose class I almost never showed up for the following semester was hosting a debate on healthcare policy. And, the Harvard Kennedy School sent one of their professors who was representing the Obama campaign. And I showed up as the representative of the Romney campaign and said, sorry, professor, this is why I haven't been coming to class. And he thought that was very funny.
By the way, people should show up for class.
Go to class.
Make certain. This is a public service announcement.
Yes. Third year of law school here's the flip side. Law school should only be 2 years. So you have a little flexibility in that third year. But look, I mean, it was very different in that Romney was the nominee running a general election. So just the scale of the campaign gets much larger. Certainly it was very different for me at that point from, going from the kind of intern to somebody who actually had a lot of responsibility, had my policy team. And so I think, what I valued most about it was just that so much trust is placed in a very small group of people. I mean, one thing you learn, but the policy shop is the smallest part of a of a presidential campaign. Is that good or not? That's a larger discussion.
But it's probably one of the most important parts.
Well,
because that's where your platform comes from, and that's what you're going to run on, right?
That's right. And on the flip side, you learn how little policy really does matter in a lot of ways, in a presidential campaign. You have to have it. You have to be ready if you win to implement it. But if you look at, what voters want to know about, what they care about, the details of different people's healthcare plan isn't really it. It's really about, but like, what are your actual values? What are your priorities? What do you think the problems are?
And what can you actually get done? Because, policy is one thing. I think we're all seeing that now, right? Whatever campaign promises are made from either party, either side, whatever policy you want to put in effect is all subject to, for the most part, a bipartisan approach where a lot of times good legislation or good policy is going to get muddied up because of personal failings. So, that's a dynamic I don't think many people take into consideration, especially when they're voting.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And I think in hindsight, I've written about this a little bit. I think we were very good on the technical side of, governing and policy ideas. But what's probably more important, and what I certainly myself did not do a good job of at all, is understanding the actual problems. And, I use the example of the opioid epidemic, where by 2012, the opioid epidemic had already been the deadliest drug epidemic in
So think
this
about
country.
this. You made a statement earlier about addicts and, why should we be paying for this or why should we be doing this? Fast forward, your experience. I think a lot of it is we witness it firsthand, people we know, and then you take a whole different approach on that.
Yeah, well, and that's right. And I think certainly at that point, if I had appreciated the issue, I would have appreciated the importance of addressing the issue. But opioid epidemic as an issue at all just was on nobody's radar. I mean, it was the sort of thing that you would hear.
Big Pharma had it.
Well, yes, exactly. But as we would start, and New Hampshire is a perfect example of a state that was really suffering from it. Obviously, very in focus in a Republican primary. The political folks out there in the field started calling back to the policy team saying, "What's our plan for the opioid epidemic?" And I'm literally Googling, like, what is an opioid? I mean, there was no awareness.
I imagine in your high school there weren't too many drug dealers, right?
Not at the time, certainly, but nor were there in certainly Republican policy circles. I think it's safe to say Democratic policy circles as well. There was a total disconnect from the fact that this was even happening.
Right.
And so the same with like deindustrialization and the kinds of jobs that had been lost. The fact that we were in 2012, the typical wage in America was actually lower than it had been in the 1970s. And
but inflation kept growing. Prices kept,
right.
expanding.
And so in sort of even in adjusting for inflation, so in kind of real terms, and no one had any sense of that. And so while we had great policy proposals for what we thought the world was, I think we did not have a good understanding of what was actually going on in the country. And that certainly didn't serve the candidate well. And ultimately, it wasn't serving the country well.
So fast forward, do you think we have a good understanding of the policy now?
I think some people do. And there are debates going on within both parties about it that I think each get some of it right and some of it wrong. I think within the Republican Party and on the right of center, there's a much greater understanding of a lot of the cultural frustrations, certainly. But we are having a knockdown, drag-out fight over the economic situation. I am still going and doing debates at the American Enterprise Institute, which one can imagine from its name what its
Sure.
orientation might be. We still have to have a debate whether it's fair to say that people have never had it so good in America. A lot of people will look at
I have true testimonials that'll debate that all day long and contradict that.
And this is the exact disconnect, is that if you use the kind of official economic data and say, okay, well, how much stuff can somebody afford to buy now? And especially if you take into account all of the government programs and support we have, I think it is fair to say that almost everybody has more stuff than before, right? Like your TV is bigger, you're more likely to have air conditioning.
Well, we have more unessential stuff.
Yes.
Right. But does that make the problem really go away?
No. And I think that is exactly the punchline in my mind, is that we have built this economic system and analyze it in a way that thinks that all stuff is equal, right? It would reject even your idea of essential versus non-essential stuff, because whatever somebody wants to pay for, that's what's essential.
Yeah, and that's not right.
No, it's
because
completely.
think about you talk about the housing crisis 2008, 2009, right? And that was a big bank play, right? I think we all can agree on that, big money grab. And it wasn't from the people actually purchasing the homes. It was record high foreclosures. People went into financial disarray. People committed suicide over it. But there was a criteria set that said, hey, if you made $50,000 per year, you could afford a $350,000 house. So people are going out there getting qualified. They don't take into consideration forget the mortgage, but the taxes, the utilities, and everything else. People were losing their homes. They were hoodwinked into, hey, you qualify, you're middle class. And obviously that was an awful time, but you always look at awful situations like that as a learning tool to never make that same mistake again. Fast forward, where are we at now, in your opinion, on economic crisis for working people? Are we still in an economic crisis, or are we coming out of it? I mean, there's a lot of debate on what the Republicans are going to do, what the Democrats are going to do. Where do we need to be, in your opinion?
Well, I think we're definitely still in the crisis. And I think sort of the best measure, people always say, well, if these economic measures get things wrong, what should we be measuring? And I think if there's a single thing to focus on, it's the question of whether the typical job that, an American without a college degree, wherever they might live, that your typical job is going to pay enough to support a family and provide middle-class security. And just it's worth, in my humble opinion, unpacking that for a moment, because each of those is sort of a politically contentious statement. So the idea, for instance, that a single wage earner should be able to support a family itself, you have a lot of people on the left that, you want to put, send women barefoot and pregnant back into the kitchen. No. If both parents want to work, that's great. But that needs to be their choice. There needs to be a situation where if you do want to support your
I don't
family
think there's any choice now where you can have a single parent working, supporting a family.
Certainly, well, again,
it's a necessity to have both parents working for the most part.
If you are working at one of those law firms on Wall Street, you probably can. But if you're looking at what the typical job pays for the typical American worker, it is not enough. And then the question is, what is it not enough for? Because the other thing that people will say is, well, wait a minute, let's look at what somebody had in the 1970s, the size of their house, the quality of their car, the kind of healthcare they got. You could afford that with one income. So what are you complaining about?
Well, you're not paying $500,000 for a modest home back then. You're not paying $50,000 for a modest vehicle, and tuition isn't $50,000 a year in college. So, you can put any data along, but the reality of the cost of everything has gone up and the wages haven't kept up with it. Although CEO and corporate America's pay has gone up by 100% in some cases.
Right. And so I love that you just listed that set of things, because that's exactly the right set of things to focus on. And it goes back to this question of sort of essential versus non-essential, because there are a whole bunch of non-essential things where the price has plummeted, right? Your television, your air conditioning, and so forth. And then there are the things that are actually essential to middle-class security and building a good life, which is, can you afford a modest home in a good neighborhood? Can you afford to buy a car? And what what has gone wrong is that what those things look like is just different, right? A 1970s beater, if you can even find one in a used car lot, sure, that's real cheap. But that's not what middle class security looks like today.
If you get a 1970s beater in California, you're going to get arrested for emissions violations. So
that's right. It doesn't have seat belts and so on and so forth. Same with a house, right? If you actually go back and look at how, houses were a lot smaller, they didn't have a lot of amenities, but that's not what a good house in a middle class neighborhood looks like today. And so same with healthcare. If you say like, well, what if I only gave you access to the quality of healthcare and drugs from the 1970s? That would probably be cheap, but you can't get that insurance plan even if you wanted to, nor should that be what we're telling people to expect. Because I think one thing, and again, this is something kind of my side I think gets very wrong, is on one hand, they go out there and promise, embrace our theory of economic growth, a rising tide will lift all ships. This is going to kind of carry us all forward together. And then when it doesn't actually do that, and a whole people, and a lot of, maybe even most people get left behind, they then turn around and say, well, what are you complaining about? Why does it matter that you got left behind? You can still afford the things you used to. And I think what we have to do is say, no, in a just society, in a society that's actually promoting human flourishing, in the kind of society and nation we should want to live in fact, everybody needs to move up together.
No, regardless.
That's right.
Regardless. Now, I mean, you're a breath of fresh air because there's no doubt you're a Republican. You've worked on Romney's campaign. You worked on the Trump 2016 campaign, correct?
I don't think, no, not on 2016.
But you probably advised and
I'm in those circles.
You're in those circles, yes. The ones that, they probably wouldn't allow us in. However, I think that's changing.
Not anymore.
It's changing.
I saw somebody up there at the Republican National Convention.
And it's changing. And I think it's change that's necessary and warranted. But it comes with a lot of scrutiny, a lot of criticism, just like I'm sure you face. You are the co-founder of American Compass. And what is American Compass?
So American Compass is an organization we founded in 2020. To catch everybody up, we talked about, law school, Bane. I then went to Manhattan Institute to start doing real public policy work. It's a fantastic think tank, right of center, but fairly conventional conservative establishment. And it got to be 2020. It was most of the way through Trump's term at that point. And if you looked around, the conservative world still all just sort of had its head down, saying this too shall pass, and we can kind of go right back to Paul Ryan. And that seemed obviously wrong to me. Not consistent with the work I was doing, seemed politically absurd, and just seemed substantively wrong. We weren't going to address problems that way. And so we founded American Compass to be an organization that was sort of distinctly conservative on the right of center.
A Republican organization.
Yes. Well, we are a C3, so we're nonpartisan.
And I think you'll recognize what we've been doing as an organization, and I can just speak about my organization, is that we have been working bipartisan across the aisle, finding common ground on a lot of these issues, mainly with the objective to protect American workers, to promote organizing, and we're promoting manufacturing in this country once again. And I think the biggest example is going to be how are these tariffs going to have an effect on the American worker. And I know you've embraced and encouraged unionization of manufacturing. How are these tariffs going to have an effect if they are imposed as they were presented? And I think we all understand that a lot of these tariffs that current administration have come out of the gate strong on a leverage. They're tools to get something like in Mexico, immediately put a 25% tariff on. What happens at that point in time? 10,000 troops are put on the border from Mexico. Tariffs are put on hold, so to speak. What are these tariffs going to have? And is it going to be a positive effect on working people? And what effect is it going to have on the economy? Because it's two different things.
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's really important that you started with that distinction. You said we all understand some of these are negotiating tariffs. The funny part is that economists don't, or they pretend not to. And they say 25% tariff on Mexico, that's insane. You must not know don't you understand? Because they don't even appreciate the idea that we could use our economic leverage to actually promote our interests, right? They just want tie our hands behind our back. Everything's a free market. And as long as stuff is cheap, we should be happy. And so you're right. Some of the things that Trump is doing is clearly negotiating leverage. But then some of it, especially focused toward China, focused now, you're hearing him talk about what he calls reciprocal tariffs, which is essentially, well, if the rest of the world is going to have tariffs on things we're trying to sell, we are going to have tariffs too.
Well, I think we're probably paying more tariffs on the stuff we're selling overseas, right? Than most.
Oh, absolutely. And again, because the U.S. model and this, the whole sort of commitment to free trade and this belief that, we have the World Trade Organization, we're going to welcome China in. If you actually go back and look at the people
which was not good for the American worker.
It was not.
Devastating.
It was a huge mistake. And what's fascinating is that it never was really about economics or workers at all. It was about this idea that we were going to promote what they call the liberal world order, right? We were going to promote our free trade and democracy, and China was going to embrace that, and everyone would benefit as a result. The reality is that was an incredibly naive way to approach the world. And what we're left with right now is sort of having let all of our guard down, saying, we will turn the other cheek regardless of what other countries do. And the rest of the world just sort of exploiting that.
Sure.
And I think, the cost of that, and to your point, the impact on workers has been that the U.S. has just become the country where the rest of the world sends its extra stuff. And so the rest of the world, countries like China, also countries like Germany.
So I'll give you a China story that happened yesterday.
Yeah.
As you know, we're in a battle with United Airlines. We've got 10,000 technicians that basically fix the planes and make certain that they're safe and they're flying in the air. We're in contentious negotiations. And by the way, they're making record profits. I've asked for a meeting with their CEO, Kirby, to try and get this thing resolved. But yesterday, we have what they call the scope of the agreement. It's the work that's covered under the agreement, proposed across the table, because we want to take our work, the mechanic work that's being performed in China, and bring it back to the United States. There's a huge facility in San Francisco that's laying dormant where we used to do all this work. Now, if we put these huge tariffs and pass policy, all that work for United Airlines, which is an American company, is going to come back and put Americans to work. But you have companies like United Airlines that are exploiting the American worker by sending that work overseas. Why are we not focused on tariffing the shit out of these American companies that want to choose to send these work overseas? I mean, you look at all the bad trade agreements, NAFTA, you look at the China and the WTO. Who passed all that stuff? What administration? Was it a Democrat or a Republican? It was a Democrat, right? Democratic. And we should be embracing and fighting collectively, bipartisan, to get that work back. And that's just one example. And I got to believe there's thousands of examples of the same scenarios.
There absolutely are. And what everybody got so wrong, actually, there are two things. One was it was supposed to be, okay, we're actually going to have trade. So some things we used to do, maybe China will do, maybe Germany will do, but other things that China and Germany used to do will do. Mm-hmm. And we'll get new opportunities to sell into their markets. And that second part just never happened, right? There's a war. If that did happen, it could have been good for American workers, but it didn't. And so what has happened instead is we have these huge trade imbalances. About $1 trillion a year, where other countries produce stuff for us, but they don't buy stuff from us. Instead, is a technical point, but an important one, they buy our assets, right? So the trade we are actually making is we get stuff from them and we send back ownership of our companies, ownership of our real estate, treasury bonds, pieces of paper that say, we owe you, we will pay you someday. And so we simultaneously hollow out the workforce today by just losing those jobs.
Put ourselves further in debt as a country.
And we put ourselves further in debt going forward. It's wildly irresponsible. And the defense of it is, but we get lots of cheap stuff.
So just think if the American worker ran their household like these trade agreements.
It would,
homelessness.
I'm so glad you said that, because one of the things that the economists say and the people defend this say is they say, well, trade deficits don't matter. You run a trade deficit with the grocery store, right? So they point out there are plenty of places you buy things from but don't sell things to. which is true. But of course, you also have a job. You have a place to get money from. And it is so bizarre to me that they think that this is a good argument, that, well, this is fine. You buy stuff from your convenience store, when the actual argument is exactly the one you just made. If we allowed households or people to run their lives this way, to say, wow, look at all these credit cards we're getting in the mail. Let's open them all up. Let's spend them all right up to their limit because we're getting so much stuff and we don't even have to work. Like, there is a formal economic way in which I guess that looks brilliant. You didn't have to do any work. You got lots of stuff.
OPM, other people's money.
Other people's money. But we're all capable in that context of stepping back and saying, wow, that is really not a good decision. And we need to be able to do that for America also.
It'd be like me saying that, does anybody have a bad idea? Right? But, getting back to that, it's I love to see stuff manufactured in America because I know American workers are going to producing it, and we're going to be creating middle-class jobs. I mean, you look at Ohio. Ohio's a great state, once proud state, a lot of manufacturing. It's desolate. Pennsylvania used to produce all the steel in this country, right? Why are we not producing steel here? Why are we paying all this money to import it from different countries? And look, we'll get backlash from other countries saying, well, we've got a good relationship. Relationships are great, but we got an obligation to keep American people working and make certain that we establish a middle class. And I think the Republicans have a great opportunity because through this whole election, they were fancying themselves, and some of them are very passionate about embracing the working class. You've got senators like Josh Hawley, Roger Marshall, even my new friend Mark Wayne Mullen has changed his position on some things. We've got Bernie Moreno from Ohio. We've got Senator Sullivan. We've got a coalition that we're building, and we've all had extensive conversations on how the Republicans have a great opportunity to become the working party's people because of what they were saying and doing, and also the support that I think rank and file gave throughout this whole country to the Republicans, because they were fed up with the far left. They were fed up with the Democrats who, instead of listening and embracing the wants and needs of the people they're elected to represent, it was kind of like a dictatorship where pointing the finger, you need to do this, and you need to vote this way, and this is what you need to do. So the Republicans have a great opportunity, but the Democrats also, and I think they're failing miserably right now, and this is an unqualified opinion because I was attacked from the far left because of the position we took or didn't take during the election, but more importantly, because we had the opportunity to speak at the RNC. And I seen how vicious and how vindictive the far left can be, and the far right. I mean, you've got the Rand Pauls of the world that are going to say no matter what, and then you've got the far left, and who's really on my shit list right now is Senator Schumer. We talked about trade earlier. Senator Schumer is on TV when the tariffs were announced initially on Mexico, and he's holding up a Mexican brewed beer, which I think people like. I mean, I've had a couple Coronas in my life. I know it's hard to believe. Another beer, and that's all well and good. But you're using that as an example when we've got a company like Anheuser-Busch Budweiser who put 5,000 to 6,000 people per year to work with union contracts, American brewed beer. Like, that's offensive to American worker by doing that. And the position that they're taking as far as these social issues, and social issues are extremely important. But getting back to what we talked about earlier, it's about economics. It's about people who can afford houses, can afford to send their kids through school, afford gas and groceries. It's simple economics. And I think the Democrats have a lot of work to do on their side. And right now,
well, I think the point you made about the sort of far left and far right, I think it's exactly right, because I actually just wrote a piece about this, that everyone is focused on the problem of the far left.
I think I may have it in front of me, right?
Oh,
yeah.
There you go.
I think it is called, now it's the Republicans who are being held hostage by fringe groups.
That's the one. Find it on your local New York Times webpage. The
Post won't put that on there, will they?
I don't know.
They attacked me yesterday.
Fair enough. Who won't print anything for me is the Wall Street Journal, because
you and I have a mutual combat against them.
There you go. Well, and so, I mean, they are actually an example of one of these essentially fringe right groups. And I think a lot of very good discussion has been going on now about what's called the groups on the left, right? These groups that push for these very extreme, typically social positions on immigration, on transgender issues, on race, on climate, and bizarrely kind of capture and steer the Democratic Party, even though they represent virtually no one, and really are a very counterproductive force. On the right of center, the Republican Party, we have the same thing, but it's on the economics. It's the Wall Street Journal editorial board. It's these groups like Americans for Tax Reform and the Club for Growth, who just think tax cuts are the only thing that matters. And whatever is good for corporations is what we should be doing. And if you say anything except cut taxes more, they're calling me yesterday a left-wing loser for merely suggesting that maybe tax cuts aren't the most
They call me a
important thing.
right-wing traitor.
There you go. So we're ships passing somehow. And they have the same effect in the Republican Party. And there is such an opportunity, exactly as you described, really for whoever gets there first. You know, my own hypothesis is that the Republican Party is probably closer to moving in the right direction right now for some of the reasons you just described, whereas the Democrats almost seem to still be getting pulled further away. But the Republican Party is still in a very tenuous position on all of this stuff. You could have a Trump administration that over the next couple of years focuses on the stuff you and I are talking about and wins an incredible victory for American workers. You could also have one that just spends the next year bogged down in a fight over a tax cut.
Litigation.
And for that matter, you know, going back and trying to oppose anything positive for labor. And even you still have folks, you know, opposing tariffs and saying we just do need more free trade. And so there are these fights going on within both parties right now. And I just think the most important thing is, first of all, to be willing to stand up to it. And that's what we try to do on the right of center. And I think it's exactly what you're doing on the left of center, is to say, guess what, guys? Like, nothing bad happens to you. These groups have no actual power. They can call you names. They can go crazy on Twitter, and nothing happens. They are paper tigers. And the more that people actually see that, I think the more positive movement that we'll hopefully see.
I think the general public and the general American society doesn't want to see a civil war. I think right now there's an appetite for change, which I think, do we agree with everything that's going on? Absolutely not. But is it something that you draw a line in the sand on and throw a knockout punch over? No, it's getting in a room, having conversations with people. I mean, your training from right out of high school into college into your career, it wasn't drawing a line in the sand. It was actually analyzing people's opinions and data and not necessarily embracing one certain idea. And I think that's what needs to happen in trying to get some of the Democrats and some of the Republicans to forget about what's been going on. Because if there's no clear example, the last 4 years, this system is broken.
I feel like we reached a point where labor was not even supposed to be focused on worker interests, and being pro-labor didn't actually mean supporting workers. It meant sort of, well, what is best politically for this set of, labor leaders and Democratic Party officials who and their careers. And I harbor no ill will to those, folks. Don't want to go after them, but what matters, I think, for a healthy labor movement and for policymakers should be, okay, but what do the workers actually want, and what are they concerned about?
Well, that's an important point, because what we do every day in our job is predicated upon who we work for and what their wants and needs are, and that's the rank and file members. And it's a pretty simple procedure to follow. And it's no different with the politics in this country. It's not about, this senator versus that senator, or this congressperson versus this congressperson. It's about what the constituents who you work for in your area, what are their wants and needs, and why are you not fulfilling them? And you're getting involved in this political civil war that's not going to benefit anybody that you represent.
Right. But I think it's safe to say, I'm curious your thoughts on this, that is not sort of typical even in the labor movement. Like for me, the fact that you guys just even were willing to release the polling on what your members thought about the presidential election stood in such stark contrast to everybody who was just endorsing Kamala Harris. And I don't even know how many of them even did survey members, or if they did, certainly didn't want to say what the result was. I remember being at a roundtable once with leader of one of the major unions who literally was proud of how effective a job they had done sort of changing their members' political views and how much more work they had to do to sort of truly educate them, rather than seeing their role being as sort of being a representative of what the workers
think about what
thought.
you just said. They changed their opinion and educated them. Educate them how? On their views?
Yes.
Right? No different than what the Democrats are doing during this election. Chuck Schumer's of the world, the vice president candidate, what's his name, Tim Walz. Yeah, he called me out one time saying that he didn't say me by name, but obviously everybody knew that union leaders should have the courage to endorse the people that are right. Well, maybe that's a true statement, maybe it's not, but I had the courage to include our members in the process, and I had the courage to release the data. And I think that's tremendous courage. And I think my response to him was, that's funny coming from a guy that looks like a creepy high school wrestling coach, right?
That's one response.
Right? That's the Boston coming out of me. But the reality is, you made a great point. I changed their mind. Our job is not to change people's minds. Our job as labor leaders is to listen to our members, more importantly, and then embrace and respect their thoughts and wants, right? But also try and mesh them into an agenda that's going to work for political people. I don't have all the right decisions. I make more mistakes than anybody, probably on a daily basis, and I own it. So for someone to say, I educated my members, you're not a brainwasher. You're a labor leader. And that's what you should be focused on.
And ideally on the actual economic concerns of
Right.
the workers that are in fact the premise of the labor movement. The number of, because I'll also push folks, I'll say like to folks in the labor movement, like, well, why is this or that social issue, or why is the war in Gaza sort of, is that really what your workers want? And
again, hopefully we're beyond a lot of this stuff and some conflict's going to end, and hopefully we'll get back on track. So where do you see the 101st day? What do you see the 101st day looking like in this administration?
That's a loaded question. I have found that one never covers oneself in glory predicting what's going to be happening in a Trump administration. I think I can kind of describe two scenarios. There is one where the Doge continues doging, and we are in the middle of a huge knockdown, drag out tax cut fight. Even just this week, we've seen a lot of Republicans in Congress move forward.
Is tax cuts good for the economy or bad for the economy in your view? Me personally, I have no problem paying taxes.
Yeah.
I have this debate with a lot of my friends where I'll say, look, I love where when I was raising my family, my kids, I didn't mind paying taxes as long as I got the services, right? I don't mind being taxed as long as it's going to be good for the economy.
Yeah. I think I don't like, and I don't think anyone likes higher taxes for the sake of hhigher taxes, right? I'd love to have taxes
You want a purpose associated.
be as low as they can, but they also have to be high enough to pay for the services that we want. And I think a huge mistake that the Republican Party has made is to disconnect those two things and say, we're just going to cut taxes regardless of the size of government, and then maybe try to use that as an excuse to then cut government also. And first of all, it just doesn't work that way. We have done all of these tax cuts. Government has just gotten bigger, and our deficits have gotten totally unsustainable, which is very bad for the economy. And then politically, I think the problem is you also can't come around and talk about spending cuts that are needed and ask people to make sacrifice on that side, and then pair that with another big tax cut.
I think perfect world would be great is, people cutting back on a fat government, right? And actually providing services that are going to be efficient for the American people. I don't think anybody would have a problem with that. But also, you know, if you're going to tax working people or tax, you know, whoever, why are we not putting big corporate taxes on these corporations that are exempt and they're making billions upon billions of dollars? Why can't we navigate through a policy that encompasses everybody sharing in the taxes?
Right. I don't know, because politics, but I think that's exactly right. And, you know, the point that we try to emphasize at American Compass, we do a ton of work on this is sort of what we think is the fundamentally conservative approach, that there's nothing conservative about just saying we always cut taxes no matter what. The conservative thing to do would be to say, you know, let's figure out where government can be more efficient. Let's figure out where we might even need to cut some things we don't want to because we really are in a terrible budget situation. But let's also pair that with showing that we understand we're going to have to ask more of some people. We certainly can ask more of, as you said, the corporations who got the incredibly excessively large tax cut last time around.
Some of them don't even pay taxes. I mean, look at Amazon.
And I think if you had I think it is actually the politically smart thing to do too, to actually, right? I don't think it is, and it has not been a political winner to behave the way either party has been behaving on the budget. I think the politically popular view, and we've done a lot of polling that suggests the American people understand this, would be to say, look, we've sort of dug ourselves this hole. It's the same thing sort of with free trade and tariffs. We've dug ourselves this hole. Getting out of it isn't free. There are going to be costs associated with it. But if we can all be honest about where we're trying to get to and how we're going to share the burden of getting there, we will all end up better off for it. And that is what leadership is.
Well, leadership's making the tough decisions and incorporating everybody in some sort of sacrifice. We always refer to it, hey, look, there might be some short-term pain for some long-term gain. And I think we're at a critical crossroads where there's an opportunity to do it. It's just a matter of how you implement something and facilitate, you know, the average person's needs versus corporations versus the political fallout as a result of some of that stuff. But it's going to be interesting to see on the 101st day. What does a day in the life of Oren Cass look like?
Well, I live out in Western Massachusetts. I work from home for the most part. So either it is getting up extremely early to fly somewhere, but preferably most of the time it is getting the kids off to school, spending a long time clearing out all of the emails that have come in over the past day. And then a mix of probably about half my time on organizational stuff. Obviously, we have to do fundraising. We're, you know, managing the organization, planning events and so forth. And then about half the time actually getting these ideas out there, whether it is our podcast, joining other podcasts, writing. I write a Substack a couple times a week. I write every month for both the New York Times and the Financial Times. I always have one other essay kind of on the back burner, and just keep pumping this stuff out there because I believe ideas matter, but you gotta share them with people.
And I understand you're on the Lennox School Committee?
Yes.
How is that? Is that one of the most challenging assignments you have?
It's fascinating. I love it. I sort of, you know, I never talk about it in the kind of public side of things because I don't see it as at all related to my policy work. It is something that I think is hopefully useful to the community, and public education is a passion of mine, and so just sort of feel very fortunate to get to do some of that too.
Excellent. So, what is your podcast?
My podcast it's just the American Compass podcast. We do an episode every week. If you've found this not sufficiently wonky and are looking for something wonkier, come on down. We're talking about it all the time.
Absolutely. So where can it be found?
So we've just actually launched a new magazine called Commonplace. You were very kind. You wrote a terrific piece for us.
Yes,
and
it was great. Thank you.
You know, as I described with sort of American Compass being a response to just the lack of conservative attention to where I think things are headed, Commonplace is now the exact same thing for the sort of media world. There are a lot of old conservative editorial pages and magazines still putting out the old stuff, but it's not really where the energy is. And so, Commonplace is now publishing great stuff from everyone from dyed-in-the-wool Republicans to Sean O'Brien on where the country needs to go. The podcast, the American Compass podcast, is there. And then my Substack is called Understanding America. It's at understandingamerica.co. And I try to put an essay out every Monday, and then every Friday do kind of a roundup of what's going on and what we're reading and thinking about.
Well, that's great. Listen, I appreciate you taking the time on your busy schedule. And obviously, I appreciate your viewpoint in support of organized labor and the American worker. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, likewise, appreciate everything you're doing and really enjoyed this conversation. So thank you.
Excellent. Thank you.